Diane Lucas,
And this is Mick, the Doctor of Digital.
and welcome to Love Letters. Love Letters, a collection of love stories of people get lost, get crazy, and disoriented in the name of love. Another week, another great episode. Apps for dating, unspoken expectations versus practical ancient applications for modern dating relationships.
In a culture where dating often feels like a revolving door of apps and unspoken expectations, the encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman in John 4 offers strikingly modern wisdom. This ancient conversation, marked by honesty, dignity, and spiritual curiosity, shows us how vulnerability and attentive listening can transform even the most complicated relationships. We can draw practical insights from that well-timed meeting to help today's singles and couples build deeper connections, authentic trust, and a love that truly satisfies.
Truly satisfied. And Mr. Make the image of this, let's say, the image of this woman becoming the most effective evangelist in the gospel is powerful. But what does this mean practically, or couples today who are dealing with sexual shame or brokenness in their relationships?
The woman at the well provides a roadmap for sexual healing that's both psychologically sound and theologically grounded. Her journey from shame to evangelism demonstrates that sexual brokenness doesn't disqualify us from intimate relationships. It can actually enhance our capacity for authentic connection when processed through divine grace. First, let's talk about the timing of disclosure in dating relationships. The woman practices selective honesty initially. I have no husband, but moves toward full transparency as she experiences acceptance. This suggests that complete sexual histories don't need to be shared on first dates. They shouldn't be permanently hidden from serious partners either. Augustine's principle applies here. Truth telling should happen within relationships that have demonstrated safety and commitment. Premature disclosure can be as harmful as permanent concealment. Couples need to create contexts where difficult conversations can happen without immediate judgment or rejection. The early church fathers consistently emphasize that the woman's shame begins healing through encounter with divine love before human love. This suggests that individuals need personal spiritual healing to participate fully in intimate relationships. When we expect partners to provide the acceptance and validation that only God can give, we create codependent rather than covenant relationships. John Chrysostom notes that the woman doesn't become defensive when Jesus exposes her history. She moves immediately toward deeper spiritual conversation. This illustrates emotional maturity, the ability to acknowledge difficult truths without becoming overwhelmed by shame or reacting with anger. Dating couples need to develop this capacity for non defensive communication about sexual histories. Practical steps for creating safety around sexual disclosure might include establishing ground rules for difficult conversations, agreeing not to use sexual histories as weapons during conflicts, and focusing on current commitment rather than past failures. The goal isn't detailed confessions, but honest acknowledgement of how past experiences affect present capacity for intimacy. The woman's integration of spiritual and sexual identity provides a model for Christian couples. She doesn't compartmentalize her theology and her sexuality. Her encounter with Christ transforms her understanding of both worship and relationships. Modern couples need spaces where they can discuss how their faith affects their sexual choices without falling into legalism or license. Ambrose of Milan's emphasis on worship in spirit and in truth suggests that couples should engage in shared spiritual practices that acknowledge their full humanity, including sexuality. Prayer, Bible study, and worship should address real life relationship challenges rather than maintaining artificial spiritual facades. The woman's immediate shift from receiving grace to offering ministry demonstrates that healing sexual shame involves moving beyond self absorption towards service. Couples who have experienced sexual healing, whether from addiction, abuse, infidelity, or other brokenness, often find that their testimony becomes a resource for others facing similar challenges. Jerome's observation about the woman leaving her water jar illustrates the transformation of priorities that accompanies spiritual healing. Original agendas, whether that's finding the perfect partner, Achieving sexual satisfaction or maintaining social approval becomes secondary to spiritual reality and authentic relationship. For couples dealing with sexual addiction, the woman's pattern of seeking satisfaction in multiple relationships that ultimately disappoints provides insight. The living water that Christ offers represents internal spiritual resources that reduce compulsive behavior. Recovery involves developing these internal resources rather than just avoiding external triggers. The conversation's progression from personal shame to theological inquiry suggests that sexual healing and spiritual growth are interconnected rather than sequential. Couples can pursue both simultaneously through practices like spiritual direction, Christian counseling, and participation in recovery communities that integrate faith and psychology. Origen's interpretation of the five husbands as representing different sources of false satisfaction applies directly to modern dating culture. We might seek ultimate fulfillment through career success, social media validation, sexual conquest, romantic intensity, or consumer purchases. Each provides temporary satisfaction but leaves us thirsty again. Recognizing these patterns is the beginning of healing. The woman's evangelistic effectiveness after her encounter with Christ suggests sexual brokenness, when healed through divine grace, can actually enhance rather than hinder our capacity for ministry and service. This challenges purity culture messages that past sexual experiences permanently damage our spiritual usefulness. For couples from backgrounds of sexual shame or abuse, the woman's interaction with Jesus provides a model of healthy masculine energy, protective without being possessive, honest without being harsh, accepting without being permissive. Men can learn from Jesus' approach to speaking truth in love, while women can learn from the women's capacity to receive truth without defensiveness. The disciples' surprise at finding Jesus talking with a woman illustrates how sexual healing often challenges cultural and religious assumptions. Couples engaged in this healing process may encounter resistance from family, church, or peer communities that prefer simple categories of pure and impure, good and bad. The woman's statement, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did," demonstrates integrated honesty, acknowledgement of the past without ongoing shame. This becomes possible when we understand that our identity comes from divine love rather than our sexual history. Couples need to help each other move from past focused shame to future focused hope. Modern trauma therapy confirms the woman's healing progression. Safety, Jesus accepts her despite her history; truth, honest acknowledgement of her story; and meaning, transformation of her experience into ministry. Dating couples can intentionally create relationships that support this progression for both partners. The timing of Jesus' messianic revelation before the woman's behavioral change demonstrates that acceptance precedes transformation. Couples need to love each other as they are while both supporting each other's growth. This requires the difficult balance of acceptance and accountability that mirrors divine grace. In conclusion, the woman at the well provides practical guidance for modern couples: create safety for truth telling, seek spiritual healing alongside relational development, integrate rather than compartmentalize sexuality and spirituality, and view past sexual experiences as potential foundations for deeper compassion and more effective service rather than permanent disqualifications from intimate relationships.
Mr. Mick, this framework of safety, truth, and meaning making seems applicable beyond just sexual issues to relationship healing in general. But I'm curious about something. The disciples return and are shocked to find Jesus talking with this woman. What does the reaction teach us?
The disciples' shock reveals how those even closest to Jesus can carry cultural blind spots that limit their understanding of divine grace. John writes, "Just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asks, 'What do you want?' or 'Why are you talking with her?' This moment of stunned silence speaks volumes about their assumptions and Jesus' countercultural approach to relationships. John Chrysostom preaches extensively on this moment, noting that the disciples have been with Jesus long enough to know he regularly breaks social conventions, yet they're still shocked by his interaction with this woman. Their surprise reveals the depth of cultural conditioning around gender, sexuality, and religious propriety. Even exposure to revolutionary grace doesn't automatically transform their inherited prejudices. Augustine analyzes the disciples' restraint in not questioning Jesus directly. He suggests this represents a form of spiritual maturity, recognizing that their teacher's behavior challenges their assumptions, but trusting his judgment rather than immediately demanding explanations. However, their silent disapproval still creates an atmosphere of judgment that contrasts sharply with Jesus' acceptance. The disciples' reaction illuminates how religious communities can inadvertently perpetuate the very shame that divine love seeks to heal. Their shock at finding Jesus with a sexually compromised woman reflects assumptions about moral contamination, spiritual propriety, and appropriate religious boundaries that Jesus consistently challenges. For modern dating couples, the disciples' response represents the reactions of family, church, and community that might arise when people choose grace over judgment in their relationships. When couples intentionally create space for sexual healing and honest conversation about difficult histories, they may encounter disapproval from religious communities that prefer simpler categories of acceptable and unacceptable relationships. Jerome notes the irony that while the disciples remain silent and judgmental, the woman becomes boldly evangelistic. Those who should understand Jesus' mission most clearly are hindered by religious propriety, while the person they would consider less qualified demonstrates remarkably spiritual insight and ministry effectiveness. This reversal challenges assumptions about spiritual authority and ministry qualification. The disciples focus on food when they return. Rabbi, eat something. Contrasts with the woman's focus on spiritual reality. They're concerned with physical necessities and social conventions, while she's engaged with eternal questions about worship, identity, and the Messiah's coming. Their priorities reveal how religious respectability can actually hinder spiritual depth. Ambrose of Milan observes that the disciples represent institutional religion's tendency towards exclusivity and boundary maintenance. They've been chosen for a special relationship with Jesus, given insider knowledge, and promised future authority in the kingdom. The woman represents divine grace extending beyond these boundaries to include the excluded and marginalized. Jesus' response to their unspoken questions, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work, suggests that his conversation with the woman is precisely the kind of ministry he came to accomplish. What seems inappropriate to the disciples is actually central to his mission. This reframes their understanding of spiritual work from boundary maintenance to boundary crossing. For contemporary couples, this tension plays out regularly. Churches may subtly or explicitly disapprove of relationships between people with different sexual histories, denominational backgrounds, or levels of spiritual maturity. The disciples' reaction represents religious pressure to maintain appearances rather than embrace the messy reality of grace. Origen develops an allegorical interpretation where the disciples represent Jewish Christianity's initial resistance to Gentile inclusion. Their shock at finding Jesus with the Samaritan woman prefigures their later surprise at divine grace extending to non Jews. This suggests that religious communities consistently underestimate the inclusiveness of divine love. The disciples' silence also reveals how shame functions in religious communities. Their disapproval doesn't need to be verbally expressed to be powerfully communicated. The woman at the well experiences explicit acceptance from Jesus, but she must have felt the disciples' implicit judgment. Many couples struggling with sexual issues experience similar dynamics in church contexts. Modern psychology recognizes this as minority stress, the additional burden experienced by those whose relationships or experiences don't fit dominant cultural norms. Even in religious communities that preach grace, couples dealing with sexual healing may encounter subtle messages that their struggles are somehow more shameful than others. The disciples' priorities also represent a form of spiritual immaturity. They're focused on immediate physical needs and the social proprieties while missing the profound spiritual transformation happening before their eyes. Jesus has just revealed his messianic identity to someone they would consider unworthy, and they're concerned about lunch. This contrast illustrates how religious training can sometimes hinder rather than enhance spiritual perception. The disciples know the scriptures, understand Jewish law, and have been chosen for ministry, yet they miss the significance of this encounter. The woman, despite her lack of formal religious education, immediately recognized the implications of meeting the Messiah. John Chrysostom suggests that the disciples' reaction represents the institutional church's tendency to prioritize order over grace, proprietary over compassion, and reputation over redemption. While Jesus is breaking down barriers between ethnic groups, religious traditions, and moral categories, the disciples are worried about maintaining appropriate boundaries. For dating couples, this dynamic plays out when religious communities emphasize rule keeping over relationship healing, sexual purity over sexual redemption, and moral appearances over authentic transformation. The disciples' silent disapproval models how religious judgment can be communicated without confrontation, creating atmospheres of shame rather than grace. The woman's bold evangelism in the face of the disciples' disapproval demonstrates resilience that comes from an authentic encounter with divine love. When we've experienced genuine acceptance from God, human judgment loses some of its power to shame or silence us. This doesn't mean becoming insensitive to community feedback, but it does mean finding primary identity in divine rather than human approval. Augustine notes that the disciples eventually learned from this encounter, as evidenced by their later willingness to cross ethnic and cultural boundaries in their apostolic ministry. But their initial reaction reveals how even intimate exposure to Jesus' teaching requires ongoing transformation of deep cultural assumptions. The disciples' presence also provides accountability for how we respond to other sexual healing journeys. Their silent judgment represents one option, maintaining moral superiority and religious propriety. But Jesus' example provides an alternative, engaging with curiosity, compassion, and recognition of our own need for grace. Modern research on religious trauma confirms that many people have been harmed more by religious communities' responses to their sexual struggles than by the struggles themselves. The disciples' reaction illustrates how religious propriety can become a barrier to the very grace it's supposed to represent. In conclusion, the disciples' response reveals how religious communities can inadvertently perpetuate sexual shame through silent judgment and misplaced priorities, but also demonstrates the possibility of growth when confronted with Jesus' radical inclusiveness and grace centered approach to human sexuality and relationships.
Mr. Mick, so we have this tension between Jesus' radical acceptance and the disciples' religious property. But the story does not end with just the woman's transformation. She goes back to her community and becomes an evangelist. What does this teach us about how sexual healing impacts our broader relationships and communities?
The woman's transformation from isolated shame to bold evangelism illustrates how authentic sexual healing extends far beyond individual restoration. It creates expanding circles of influence that can transform entire communities. Her statement to the townspeople, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" becomes one of the most effective evangelistic invitations in the New Testament. Augustine marvels at the psychology of her testimony. She doesn't hide her past or create a sanitized version of her encounter with Jesus. Instead, her transparency about her sexual history becomes the foundation of her credibility. "He told me everything I ever did." She's announcing that someone knew her completely and still offered her dignity and spiritual significance. John Chrysostom emphasizes that her evangelistic success surpasses that of the trained disciples. While the 12 often struggle to communicate Jesus' identity effectively, this woman brings her entire city to encounter him. Many believe initially because of her testimony, and after meeting Jesus personally, they declare him the Savior of the world, one of the most expansive Christological statements in the Gospels. This challenges assumptions about ministry qualifications that persist in modern church culture. The woman has no theological training, no religious credentials, no moral reputation to protect. What she has is an authentic encounter with divine love that has transformed her shame into testimony. Her brokenness becomes her authority rather than her disqualification. For contemporary dating couples, this progression from personal healing to community impact illustrates how sexual redemption creates ripple effects that exist far beyond the individuals directly involved. When couples experience authentic healing from sexual shame, addiction, infidelity, or other relational wounds, their restored relationships often become sources of hope and guidance for others facing similar struggles. Jerome notes that the woman doesn't wait until she's achieved moral perfection to begin ministry. She's still living with the man who isn't her husband, still carrying the social stigma of her sexual history, still learning about theological truth. But her encounter with Jesus creates immediate evangelistic urgency. She can't keep this discovery to herself. This timing challenges both the perfectionist and permissive approaches to ministry and leadership. Against perfectionism, it demonstrates that ministry doesn't require moral completion. Authentic encounter with grace is a sufficient qualification. Against permissiveness, it shows that ministry emerges from genuine transformation, not just therapeutic insight or political correctness. The woman's approach to evangelism provides a model for how sexual healing can inform witness more broadly. She doesn't preach at her neighbors or demand they conform to particular moral standards. Instead, she invites them to come and see, to have their own encounter with the one who offered her acceptance and transformation. Ambrose of Milan observes that the woman's ministry bridges the gap between personal testimony and communal transformation. Her individual healing becomes the catalyst for citywide spiritual revival. This illustrates how sexual redemption, when authentically integrated, can enhance rather than hinder evangelistic effectiveness. Modern psychology recognizes this as post traumatic growth, the way difficult experiences, when processed through supportive relationships, can actually increase our capacity for compassion, wisdom, and service to others. The woman's sexual brokenness, healed through divine encounter, becomes the foundation for extraordinary ministry effectiveness. The townspeople's response is equally significant. They don't reject her testimony because of her sexual history or dismiss her insights because of her gender and ethnic background. Instead, they take her seriously enough to investigate her claims and ultimately encounter Jesus personally. This suggests that authentic transformation carries its own authority, regardless of the messenger's background. Origen's mystical interpretation suggests that the woman represents the church itself, initially unfaithful, but ultimately transformed into an effective witness. Her progression from sexual brokenness to evangelistic boldness models the church's calling to acknowledge its failures while proclaiming divine grace. For couples engaged in sexual healing, the women's example suggests several practical applications. First, healing creates natural opportunities for ministry. Others who recognize authentic transformation will often seek guidance and encouragement. Second, transparency about struggles can enhance rather than undermine credibility when combined with evidence of genuine change. Third, ministry often emerges from our deepest wounds rather than our greatest strengths. The woman's evangelistic method, inviting encounter rather than demanding belief, provides wisdom for how healed couples can influence their communities. Rather than becoming preachy about sexual ethics or judgmental towards other struggles, they can model healthy relationships and create space for others to ask questions and seek support. The community's ultimate confession, we no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world, illustrates the goal of all Christian testimony. Effective evangelism leads people beyond secondhand reports to a personal encounter with divine reality. The geographic and ethnic dimensions of this revival also are significant. A sexually compromised Samaritan woman becomes the catalyst for cross cultural spiritual awakening. Her testimony bridges not just individual shame and community acceptance, but ethnic prejudice and religious division. This suggests that sexual healing, when authentic, can become a powerful force for broader reconciliation and unity. Church history confirms this pattern. Many of the most effective evangelistic movements have been led by people whose personal brokenness and healing gave them unique credibility with marginalized populations. Sexual redemption often creates particular effectiveness in reaching others trapped in cycles of shame and seeking authentic transformation. The early church fathers consistently identify this woman as a model for female ministry and leadership. Despite cultural restrictions on women's public roles, her evangelistic success becomes impossible to ignore or dismiss. Her sexual history doesn't disqualify her testimony, it authenticates it. For modern couples, this suggests that their healing journey can become a resource for friends, family, church community, and even broader culture. When sexual brokenness is transformed through divine grace into a healthy relationship, it creates a testimony that speaks particularly powerful to others struggling with similar issues. The woman's boldness in the face of potential rejection also models the courage required for effective ministry. She risks ridicule, dismissal, and further social ostracism by making public claims about encountering the Messiah. But her encounter with divine love has given her security that transcends human approval. In conclusion, the woman's transformation from sexual isolation to community evangelism demonstrates that authentic healing creates expanding circles of influence, that brokenness can become a ministry qualification rather than a disqualification, and that sexual redemption often generates unique effectiveness in reaching others who struggle with shame and seek authentic transformation.
Mr. Maker, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. Modern dating apps promises quick connections, but beneath the swipes and curated profiles lies unspoken expectations that often swipe relationships before they begin. Mr. Mike, would you like to promote something?
Sure. Write the book, grow the business. Connect with me on LinkedIn, Mick, the Dr. of Digital Smith, PhD, and also listen to the Dr. of Digital podcast and pick up a couple volumes I have on Amazon, Burning America and On Track, Ian Hunter.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Meg, the Doctor Digital, and please do listen to our baby podcast, Mental Health 101. Mental Health 101 is created for our mental health awareness. So, Mr. Meg, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Until next time, stay as well.
More to come, people. See you soon.